This is CBN NewsWatch.
It is Monday, July 27th. I'm Ephraim Graham. Ahead today, more violence in major American cities as police use tear gas in Portland to keep protesters off federal property. A possible treatment for the coronavirus and maybe a simple drug that's been on the market for decades. We're going to explore that story from Israel. And the three strikes law was supposed to keep dangerous repeat offenders off the streets, but instead it's hurt many people who are convicted of lesser offenses. And an unexpected side effect of the coronavirus. We're going to tell you how it's changed many Americans' attitudes toward the Bible. All those stories and more are ahead in this edition of CBN NewsWatch. I want to begin this half hour with another night of protests, often including violence in major cities like Portland, Seattle, Oakland, and others. Although many protesters are peaceful, the violence in many places is real. Some federal agents in Portland say they fear for their lives. George Thomas has this story.
Early this morning, hundreds of demonstrators continued to stage protests outside the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon. Police deploying tear gas and flashbangs to keep protesters off federal property as violent confrontations between activists and law enforcement entered its 8th week. In one park not too far from the protests, they discovered a bag full of loaded rifle magazines and Molotov cocktails.
Have us actually get somewhere with all these protests. You know, people are trying to go for systemic change.
Early Sunday, thousands took to the streets of Portland and more than half a dozen other cities across the country. Protests often turning from peaceful to chaotic, even fatal. On Saturday, a driver arrested after he allegedly shot and killed a man after driving through a protest in Austin, Texas. Video captured at the scene shows dozens of people running for cover as multiple gunshots ring out.
Initial reports indicate the victim may have been carrying a rifle and approached suspect vehicle. Suspect was in the vehicle and shot at the victim.
What was that?
In Aurora, Colorado, one person is shot and another injured as a person plows his Jeep into a crowd demonstrating against police brutality. In Seattle, hours after protesters set fire to a youth detention center, police and demonstrators clash on the streets, authorities there declaring a riot. In Oakland, California, the Alameda County Superior Courthouse set on fire Saturday evening by protesters. And in Richmond, Virginia, police using chemical agents after a crowd attacks officers with rocks, batteries, and other objects. All this coming as the White House threatens to send more federal agents to cities across the country gripped by weeks of violent protests. George Thomas, CBN News.
I want to turn now to the battle against the coronavirus. The White House is pushing ahead with today's planned rollout of the Senate's Republican $1 trillion relief bill. The Senate proposal comes as millions of Americans now are out of work, will lose a $600 a week federal unemployment benefit that is expiring. The GOP plan would offer 70% of former wages because many people were making more in unemployment benefits than they were on the job. The situation in Washington comes as the number of coronavirus cases is rising across the country. California, now the hardest hit state in the country, and Florida is now number 2 with more than 400,000 cases, and a spike in cases among children, like 9-year-old Kamora Linam, who died from the disease.
She was resilient and strong, and she could put a smile on your face just by looking at her.
But there is some good news, some good now, as thousands of patients are involved in the first large-scale trial of a vaccine, as Moderna is the one that could immunize people against the virus. Could another drug, a simple one already on the market for decades, be used successfully as a treatment for COVID-19? An Israeli research team believes so because of a significant breakthrough in understanding how the coronavirus reproduces in the lungs. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl brings us the story now from Jerusalem.
These are human lung cells, and they have been infected with the new coronavirus.
Professor Yaakov Nachmias leads the Hebrew University research team that's discovered how a drug on the market since 1975 could possibly combat the pandemic.
Viruses are parasites. They can't replicate on their own. They're essentially a box of protein with a single strand of genetic material inside them. In order to make more viruses, they have to get inside human cells.
Nachmias showed CBN News a microscopic view of cells infected by COVID-19.
You see these tiny green spots are actually lipid droplets in the lung, and they're not supposed to be there at all. The red thing are essentially membranes. This is the actual factory that produces more viruses. And we have never seen anything like that before. You can actually see the cells are not doing very well.
After 3 months of intense research, Nachmias saw how the virus prevents the routine burning of carbohydrates in the lungs, causing fat to accumulate.
And one of the things that we found, together with Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, is the fact that once it gets into the cells, it starts making the cells make new fat.
That was the key.
Once we found that out, we could start screening drugs that may potentially block the virus, not by targeting the virus itself, but by going after fat accumulation. So the virus needs this fat to grow and make new viruses, but a drug like fenofibrate can help the cells burn this fat, and then suddenly virus production stops.
Nachmias hopes clinical trials will begin soon.
If everything pans out and the clinical studies validate our results, it looks good. Everybody's crossing their fingers, and we hope that before the next flu season, we'll be able to bring this drug to the market.
Researchers here at Hebrew University say they hope to downgrade the threat of COVID-19 to that of the common cold. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Back here at home, a sharply divided Supreme Court denied a Nevada church's request to strike down as unconstitutional a limit of 50 people on worship services. The decision was 5-4, with Chief Justice John Roberts joining the liberal justices. 3 justices wrote strong dissents against the decision on behalf of the 4 conservatives who said they would have granted the church's request to block the law while the court considers the merits of the case. Justice Samuel Alito wrote, "We have a duty to defend the Constitution, and even a public health emergency does not absolve us of that responsibility." Alito wrote that by allowing thousands of people to gather in casinos, the state cannot say it has a compelling interest to limiting religious gatherings to just 50 people. And Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote, Nevada is discriminating against religion. Coming up, you may remember this confrontation between an Ohio teenager, Nicholas Sandmann, and other teenagers and an older Native American in Washington, D.C., while Sandmann was at a pro-life rally. It became a media firestorm, but some of the early coverage was very misleading. Now Sandmann has reached a settlement with a major newspaper. We're going to tell you about that when we come back.
Life is better with a good night's sleep. Get your free DVD or booklet of Protect Your Sleep as the world watches from the outside.
It's a big diplomatic tug-of-war here in the Middle East.
Go inside the story with Jerusalem Dateline.
Israeli archaeologists are talking about a discovery that could change the thinking about the Temple Mount.
Join CBN Jerusalem Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell and get the biblical perspective on the events shaping the world.
It's what starts in Israel then ends up going to other places.
Watch Jerusalem Dateline Friday night at 9:30 on the CBN News Channel.
Life. It's meant to be lived fully. Jesus said it. I came to give you life. Life to the fullest. Life in your family. Life in your finances. Life in your body, mind, and spirit. Life in your everyday. At CBN.com, we're taking what Jesus said seriously. We're here to help you discover life. life. Live it fully. CBN.com.
In January last year, Ohio high school teenager Nicholas Sandmann was caught up in a political firestorm while in Washington, D.C. at a school-approved pro-life rally. Several news organizations played the video that apparently showed him in a confrontation with an older Native American. Sandmann was wearing a red Make America Great Again cap, and some in the media considered Sandmann's actions to be racially motivated. But that early video turned out to be misleading, and it turned out that Sandmann was not the aggressor. Instead, he and his classmates had been accosted by counter-protesters. Now, a major update on this story, though. Joining us now for that is Dan Andros of FaithWire.com. So, Dan, what are the latest developments in this story?
Yeah, well, it looks like, according to people who were outraged at what they viewed activist media against Nicholas Sandmann, are calling it justice today, as he had filed a $250 million defamation lawsuit against the Washington Post back in February of 2019, and that lawsuit, according to Nick Sandmann on his social media accounts and his attorneys, has been settled. Now, the amount was not disclosed, but he celebrated it as a victory, and it was a long-fought battle over a year, but it looks like he has come to terms with the Post with something that he obviously feels was an acceptable agreement. So will he now be targeting more media outlets? Yeah, according to his attorneys and also to some of his tweets, it looks like there will be at least potentially 13 other outlets that could be on the chopping block to be facing another lawsuit and a decision. The attorneys listed ABC, CBS, NPR, NBC, Slate, the Huffington Post, the Guardian, the Hill, and others are all ran with this narrative that you mentioned at the top, that this was a racist teen who was angry and confronting a Native American protester, when later video and the full context came out proving otherwise. So a lot of outlets are probably shaking in their boots today, because while we don't know the amount, it was obviously a huge lawsuit at $250 million. So it's safe to assume that the settlement was a substantial amount of money, and these other media outlets all ran with that story, could face a similar decision. Now, he's also singled out another large platform. What's the story there? Yeah, this is interesting because he put a warning shot in a follow-up tweet. He said the fight isn't over. There's 2 down, 6 to go, which obviously contradicts what his attorneys mentioned, 13 outlets. So we'll see which ones they zero in on. But he said, don't hold your breath at Jack. At Jack is Jack Dorsey of Twitter, which is very interesting because Twitter obviously is a platform and not necessarily a publisher. So that one would be different than the others if they decided to go after Twitter for some of the things that were said about him on Twitter, which were part of the biggest problem that smeared his character, because high profile celebrities and others were saying all sorts of things about Nick Sandmann. One said he had a punchable face, and that went viral, and several journalists and others agreed with that sentiment. So very interesting that he has singled out Twitter, and they could be potentially facing court as well. Are you aware what life was like for Nick in the aftermath and the initial round of media coverage that labeled him to be a racist teenager? Yeah, well, it was a really tough time for him. He said he was under, quote, constant threat. And that is not surprising given some of the things that were said about him. As I mentioned, Reza Aslan was the one who said he had a punchable face. And the media just jumped onto this story, mainly because which was kind of fascinating at the time, because people were wondering why this was a news story. It was just, a teenager standing there and a protester standing there. So it was like, why is this a national news story? But it seemed to fit a narrative that the media, liked to push. He was wearing a MAGA hat. They like to say that, hey, it was a racist teen, a Trump-supporting racist. And so they just went with that narrative without doing their due diligence, looking up what the actual story was, nobody saw what the lead up was. When that first clip came out, nobody saw what had actually happened before that. And everyone went on the word of this one Native American who was standing there. And that gentleman had a long history of sort of a shady, behavior, making up things about his past service in the military, which didn't happen. And so they just went with that without checking it and without, doing their due diligence. So they really stepped in it on that one.
Thank you, Dan, so much. That is Dan Andros with faithwire.com. Much appreciated. I want to remind you that you can hear more important stories and trends in the news by tuning in tonight at 9:30 Eastern on the CBN News Channel. Still ahead, why would someone get a life sentence without parole for a low-level, non-violent drug offense? We're going to take a look at how the impact of the federal three strikes law and how it's affected some people's lives. We've got that story for you when we come back. Stay with us.
Get the top political news and analysis from Washington on Faith Nation, tonight at 6 Eastern, only on the CBN News Channel.
On October 1st, 1961, history was made when a tiny station began transmitting the first signals of the Christian Broadcasting Network.
CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network.
And now, a new era has begun with the all-new CBN News Channel.
Just moments ago, the Iron Dome intercepted an incoming rocket right on the Gaza border.
Administering in this area, spiritual warfare is definitely involved.
A 24/7 news network, bringing you the news you want from a source you can trust.
In Kenya, 40% of the medical services are actually provided by these Christian hospitals.
Let's talk about the economy.
Believers here are joining together to win people to Jesus Christ.
All your favorite shows now in one place. Go to CBNNewsChannel.com to find out how to get the CBN News Channel on your TV all day, every day. CBN News. Life is better with a good night's sleep. Get your free DVD or booklet of Protect Your Sleep today.
Life. It's meant to be lived fully. Jesus said it. I came to give you life. Life to the fullest. Life in your family. Life in your finances. Life in your body, mind, and spirit. Life in your everyday. At CBN.com, we're taking what Jesus said seriously. We're here to help you discover life. Life. Live it fully. CBN.com.
One federal inmate describes his life sentence as like being buried alive. He wasn't a murderer or a child molester. He was 28 years old and had never even committed a violent crime. So how did he get locked up for life? Caitlin Burke explains.
Really like hell, like how they describe hell. Nobody can hear you screaming, hear your screams. That's really how it is. I mean, you hear people screaming all night, and that's all I used to think about. We're in hell.
At the age of 28, a judge sentenced Herman Tate to life in prison without parole for a low-level, non-violent drug offense.
Buried alive. Just imagine it, putting you in a casket and you're alive. But you can stand up and walk around in it. That's what it is. You can't get out.
Tate's sentence fell under the federal three strikes drug law passed by Congress in the 1980s. It states that if someone is charged with a federal drug crime and already has 2 prior drug offenses, then that's the third strike, and a federal prosecutor can require the judge to impose a mandatory life sentence. Tate's first strike came in 1992 for selling half a gram of crack. His sentence, 6 months probation. He gained his second strike 2 years later. That time, he sold 7.7 grams of cocaine. Sentenced to 5 years in prison, Tate was only required to serve 8 months. Then, in 1998, he struck out, charged with conspiracy to sell cocaine. Tate, however, had never heard of the three strikes drug law, and since no drugs were found in his possession, he chose to go to trial. The prosecutor filed what's known as an 851 notice.
That means that even if the judge wanted to take pity on you, even if the judge believed that you could be rehabilitated, even if the judge believed that the sentence was too harsh, that sheet of paper meant that you had to receive a mandatory life sentence without parole.
Life.
Wow.
For nothing.
Tate headed to federal prison, where it took 2 years for the gravity of his sentence to sink in.
I keep seeing people going home, and I'm like, man, and I realize, hey, I'm never going home. And it just hit me all of a sudden. And that's when I realized that I had a life sentence in the federal system.
The 3 strikes federal drug law covers all 50 states. Many states have gone further, expanding 3 strikes laws that impose mandatory life sentences for 3 convictions of certain felonies. In California, for example, the 1994 3 Strikes You're Out law was designed to keep murderers, rapists, and child molesters behind bars. Today, however, more than half sentenced under that law are serving life sentences for nonviolent crimes. Evidence that these 3 strikes laws can result in unintended consequences. My Angel Cody is an attorney and the director of the Decarceration Collective, a team of women fighting to free people sentenced to life in prison for drugs and end the policies that put them there. Many of her clients were teenagers or young adults when convicted with their 3rd strike. The mandatory life sentence that followed, basically erasing the possibility of maturation and growth, stamping them instead as irredeemable.
The most potent example of sort of the human spirit, right, is that we tell someone you're buried alive and you're never going to leave prison. And for the person to still have the audacity and the wherewithal to get up every day and to try to make some meaning of your life, I think is, for me, it's deeply inspiring. It's why I do the work. It also is the most salient example of why we ought to go back and look at these different laws.
When Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act in 2010, it provided the potential for a lower sentence, but did nothing for those already in prison. Then, in 2018, President Trump signed the First Step Act, which finally allowed the opportunity to reconsider prior sentences. In reading the new law, Tate regained a sense of hope for the first time in nearly 22 years.
And I'm like, oh, Lord, because it fit me. I fit the criteria.
Cody and her team officially requested his life sentence be reduced. This past January, Tate learned of his freedom.
I'm just watching the TV, and my case manager come out and called my name, Tate. Took my earbuds out. I'm like, yeah, what's up? She's like, you need to come to my office right now. I'm like, oh. So I go over there, and she turns around with a big smile on her face. I'm like, what's wrong with you? She said, Tate, you going home. I just started crying. I said, don't play. She said, I'm for real. I said, don't lie to me. And that's when I found out.
Still, an estimated 800 inmates could likely die in prison under the 3 strikes drug law. A disproportionate number of them are Black.
There are all these places along the highway towards imprisonment where people get off, right? And then there are on-ramps. And what we've seen is that disproportionately, it's more difficult for African Americans to exit off of that highway, right? And that more of them are on that highway towards mass incarceration and imprisonment. Some of that relates to charging decisions that are made. Some of that relates to the rates of arrest. Some of it relates to community resources that are available.
No legislation reforming the federal 3 strikes drug law includes those sentenced to life for marijuana convictions. But Cody believes change is coming.
I absolutely believe that transformative justice will occur. And the reason why is because I think that people are awake and paying attention.
Cody says now is the time for the American people to ask questions and put pressure on our elected officials. That's because voters can make a major impact at the ballot box and be the catalyst that keeps Cody's clients and many others from being buried alive behind bars. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Coming up, the coronavirus has had an unexpected impact on American adults and what they think about the Bible. We're going to explore that story for you when we come back. Stay with us.
Life is better with a good night's sleep. Get your free DVD or booklet of Protect Your Sleep today.
I'm Ephraim Graham, and this is Studio 5. Cruise with me as I discover the good things happening in the world of music, sports, television, and movies.
The fact that Ryan Coogler was going to be directing the film, I knew that something special was going to happen.
We'll chat with artists at the forefront of entertainment and explore the connection between popular culture and faith.
I asked my pastor, I said, well, does that mean I'm supposed to be a preacher? He says, well, no, you already have a pulpit.
Watch Studio 5 Wednesday night at 9:30.
Remember for a moment what it was like to be a child. You believed every story you were told. You saw a world full of endless possibilities. What stories will the world's orphaned and at-risk children believe? We believe the Bible tells the only story truly worth believing. We believe that every child should have the opportunity to dream, the chance to take challenges and turn them into possibilities, the chance to stand on the promises of God, to recognize their place in the greatest story ever told. They have their whole lives ahead of them. Theirs is a world of endless possibilities. They are looking for a story to believe. We will tell them that story. Will you join us?
The coronavirus outbreak has affected how Americans read their Bible. A new study from the American Bible Society shows the number of adults who read Scripture is declining dramatically. It's a drop that's been going on for the last few years. But the Society also says this is an opportunity for churches to reach out to more people who want to learn more about the Bible. That's because the study also shows 68% of American adults, or about 172 million, are Bible curious, meaning they want to learn more about Scripture. People tend to look at the Bible for hope during this time of crisis, and the research found that Americans who have been personally affected by the coronavirus were more likely to read the Bible. And time now for your Monday motivation. Today, I want to leave you with this thought to jumpstart the week. If you awake with a pulse, you awake with a purpose. Your challenge is to connect with God, to walk out the day's purpose on purpose. With that word, I encourage you to make this a marvelous Monday and make sure that you're living this day on purpose with purpose. That will do it for this edition of CBN NewsWatch. I want to remind you can always find more of our programs on the CBN News Channel at any time. You can also find them online at cbnnews.com. We would love to know what you think about the stories you've seen here today. You can email us at the address right there at the bottom of your screen, newswatch@cbn.com. And of course, you can always reach out and touch us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. We would love to hear from you. Thank you again for watching. Make it a marvelous Monday. We'll see you right back here, same time tomorrow. Goodbye. God bless.